Now, let's see, where are we? We're going to begin with a few quotes. Slide one. Anybody like to read the quote?
Wait, one second, Nancy. Can I take the second one?
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, I'm not trying to. It's only a matter of time.
Hi.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I thought I read the word wrong. Okay, start again. It's only a matter of time. Will they tell you? Will they tell your story? And that's Lin-Manuel Miranda in Hamilton.
To name is to give meaning, and to give meaning is to give power. Bell Hooks, author, theorist, educator, and social critic.
Women have always been present. The problem has been visibility. Gerda Lerner, historian and women's history author.
Omar?
Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. James Baldwin.
Thank you. Now, now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce us to Betsy Carswell. She has been a maverick in building the Golden Crown Literary Society. Yay, Golden Crown. A nonprofit dedicated to increasing the visibility of sapphic literature. She grew up in a Navy family on the coast of United States, living in Virginia, Hawaii, California, South Carolina, Florida, and Maryland, before finding home in Washington, D.C. She retired from federal service in 2017 after a 32-year career in the intelligence community, where she served as a cartographer, geospatial analyst, and senior manager. Her academic background includes a BA in geography and religion, an MS in pastoral counseling, postgraduate work in geospatial intelligence, and a graduate certificate in conflict resolution and negotiation. She lives on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. with Carol, her wife of 13 years. Welcome, Betsy. You can.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. Take a moment and imagine the smallest piece of history you've ever held in your hand. Not a book, not an artifact, not a painting. A coin. Coins are ordinary. They pass from hand to hand. They disappear into couch cushions and cup holders. They're spent without ceremony. And yet, they are among the most intentional objects a nation creates. Every face on a U.S. coin represents a choice, a declaration of value, a quiet statement that says, this person matters, this story deserves to circulate. For most of American history, that declaration was made almost exclusively about men. But today, we are living through a quiet and profound shift, one in which women who fought for justice, dignity, art, labor rights, civil rights, and political power are being placed into the everyday economy of memory. Before I go further, I want to offer my thanks to Brooklyn Ethical for this kind invitation, especially to LaJaira Cooper for thinking of me. I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. I'm the board president of the nonprofit Golden Crown Literary Society, the leading literary organization for creators and readers who celebrate sapphic literature, which is literature about lesbians and women-loving women. We dedicate ourselves to enhancing the diversity, accessibility, quality, and visibility of sapphic literature. GCLS is fully inclusive of all identities, including trans and non-binary people in the sapphic literary space. The comments I make this morning are my own and don't necessarily reflect the views of the Golden Crown Literary Society. I'm going to pull back the curtain a moment on my speech preparation. In fiction writing, authors often place themselves in one of two categories: plotters, who outline and plan their book's characters, arcs, and themes, and pantsers. Think writing by the seat of your pants. And they just see where things take them. I'm not a writer of fiction, but if I were, I'm team pantser all the way. So while my speech started in one direction, it led me in a rather different one. So sit back and let's see where my unfettered brain took me. I was invited to speak about women who advocated for rights and change, and was a bit overwhelmed on how to do that on a single Sunday afternoon. I have the privilege of being married to one of the Senate staffers behind the American Women's Quarter program, so I've been privy to the decisions and progress of this amazing national effort to recognize American women on quarter coins, and my speech frame was born. Many of the women I'm going to speak about were women who loved women. While some were married to men, sometimes only briefly, many had lifelong romantic partnerships with other women. Some challenged the gender norms of the time in ways that free us to do the same. About half, while they might not have defined themselves that way, would fall within the LGBTQIA+ community by today's standards. As I mention them, think about how their queerness might have contributed to their willingness to challenge the strictures of their time. Putting people on coins is one of the oldest and most effective tools of national myth-making. Long before mass media, coins taught people who mattered, who ruled, and what story a nation told about itself. The first true portraits on coins appeared in the ancient Mediterranean. Before then, rulers avoided depicting living faces. Afterward, they embraced them. Portraits became assertions of authority and belonging. In the modern era, new republics like the United States faced a different question. How do you build national identity without a king? The answer was selective memory. Allegorical figures like liberty stood in for shared ideals, and later figures like George Washington appeared, but not as monarchs, as founders. Silence in the historical record is itself a form of power. Coins reflect who a nation believes is worth remembering. For most of U.S. history, that honor went almost exclusively to men, rulers, generals, presidents, because political and economic power lived there. The absence of women was not accidental. It mirrored who was allowed authority and visibility. From 1792 to 1979, the only women on U.S. coins were allegorical, representing liberty. The appearance of real women on coins signals a shift in national memory. Just as important as who appears is who does not. An absence tells its own story. What is emphasized or omitted in history reveals the values of the society telling the story. Keep this in mind as we move forward. Coins rarely depict dissent while injustice is ongoing. Myth-making requires closure. Coins wait until history feels safe. They appear after the consensus forms, revealing when a society is finally ready to claim a story as its own. In 1979, Susan B. Anthony became the first real woman on a circulating U.S. coin, nearly 60 years after women won the right to vote. She was relentless. In 1872, she voted illegally in a presidential election. She was arrested, she was tried, she was fined, and she refused to pay. Anthony argued that the Constitution already granted her the right to vote, and denying it violated her citizenship. She also lived a life that defied 19th century expectations of womanhood in quieter but no less radical ways. She never married a man, and historians widely agree that she formed deep, emotionally intimate, and at times romantic relationships with women. These partnerships sustained her work, shaped her worldview, and existed outside the narrow social norms of her era, even as they were later minimized or erased from public memory. She did not live to see women gain the vote nationally, but her refusal, her civil disobedience, laid the groundwork for the 19th Amendment. Her recognition, however, was complicated. The coin was unpopular, often mistaken for a quarter, and quietly discontinued in 1981. There's something deeply symbolic in that, too. How often women's contributions are acknowledged briefly, then set aside. The next woman to appear on a U.S. coin was Sacagawea, whose golden dollar replaced the Susan B. Anthony coin in 2000. A member of the Lemhi-Shoshone Nation, Sacagawea was kidnapped as a child, sold into marriage, and later compelled into one of the most famous expeditions in American history, the Lewis and Clark expedition. She served as interpreter, guide, and diplomat. She signaled peaceful intent to indigenous nations. And she did all of this while carrying an infant on her back. If you look closely, you can see little Jean-Baptiste on the coin. For generations, her story was romanticized, filtered through myth and stripped of the violence of colonization. Her appearance on the coin acknowledges that American survival depended on indigenous women's knowledge. But it also raises an uncomfortable question. Can a nation honor someone whose people it continues to marginalize? Women have always been present. The problem has been visibility. Modern commemorative programs attempt to repair historical omissions. The women chosen often expand what we define as national contribution: social reformers, artists, indigenous leaders, labor organizers, civil rights advocates. This contrasts sharply with older traditions centered on conquest and sovereignty. There's an honest paradox here. Putting women on coins doesn't automatically create equality or power, but symbols matter. Nations often change symbols before systems, and coins are one of the safest places governments test broader recognition. In that sense, women on coins are often harbingers of cultural change and not its conclusion. Public memory is produced, not inherited. Coins make this production visible. They're deliberate, curated, state-authorized memory. When a woman appears on a coin, the nation is saying her life is part of our shared inheritance. Her story belongs to everyone. Unlike statues or textbooks, coins force recognition through daily interaction. You don't have to admire them. You don't even have to notice them consciously. The history still moves through your hands. Recognition follows struggle, not achievement. Coins appear decades after movements succeed, after laws change, after resistance quiets. They don't mark the moment of change. They mark the acceptance of it. And that's why histories tied to women, indigenous peoples, LGBTQ+ communities, labor movements, and racial justice appear late or not at all. Late recognition can feel frustrating, and it should. But once a story is minted, it becomes harder to erase. The American Women Quarters Program was created by the Circulating Collectible Coin Redesign Act of 2020, led in the House by Representatives Barbara Lee, Democrat of California, and Anthony Gonzalez, Republican of Ohio, and by Senators Catherine Cortez Masto, Democrat of Nevada, and Deb Fischer, Republican of Nebraska. The National Museum of Women's History launched a website to solicit names of women to honor. Over 11,000 names were submitted. Any guesses what the number one name submitted was? It was my mom. And no, my mom isn't famous. It was my mom. After the honorees were decided and the coins designed, the U.S. Mint launched the American Women's Quarters Program in 2022. For the first time, women were not exceptions, they were the focus. And this program exists because feminist scholarship made women's history unavoidable, public demand made exclusion untenable, and the nation became ready, finally, to see women as central and not supplemental. Over 4 years, 5 women per year, the program tells a broader story of advocacy through words, science, culture, leadership, art, resistance, and care. 2022 marks a turning point. For the first time, women do not appear on coins as rare exceptions or symbolic gestures. They appear as a cohort, diverse in race, discipline, and method of advocacy. The first year asks a powerful question: what happens when voice itself becomes a form of change? Dr. Maya Angelou was a memoirist, poet, essayist, and civil rights activist, and the first Black woman featured on U.S. currency. A survivor of sexual violence, racism, and enforced silence, she transformed personal trauma into collective truth. Through poetry and memoir, Angelou reclaimed voice, not just for herself, but for generations, demonstrating that literature itself can be an act of resistance. Dr. Sally Ride was an astronaut and physicist who in 1983 became the first American woman to fly in space and the first known explicitly LGBTQ+ person honored on U.S. currency. But her advocacy didn't end in orbit. Recognizing how exclusion shapes opportunity, she dedicated her life to expanding access to STEM education, especially for girls, proving that representation must be paired with pathways. She was survived by her partner of 27 years, Tam O'Shaughnessy. Wilma Mankiller was a community organizer, activist, and the first woman elected principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. Her leadership focused not on symbolism, but on systems, building healthcare, education, and infrastructure rooted in self-determination. She showed that leadership grounded in care, collaboration, and community is still leadership, and often the most enduring kind. Also commemorated in 2022 were Nina Otero Warren, suffragist, educator, and politician, and Anna May Wong, the first Chinese-American film star. In the early 1930s, together with her partner Mamie Meadors, Nina Otero Warren homesteaded 1,257 acres of land just northwest of Santa Fe, which they named Las Dos, the Two Women Ranch. Biographers suggest that Anna May Wong was part of the queer Hollywood scene and is believed to have had romantic liaisons with women, particularly Marlene Dietrich. The women of 2022 showed us that advocacy can take many forms: poetry, science, leadership, education, performance. In 2023, the focus shifts outward from reclaiming voice to claiming space. These are women who crossed borders, preserved culture under threat, and reshaped who was allowed to lead, create, and belong. The women honored in 2023 remind us that progress often requires movement across nations, across cultures, across barriers that were never meant to be crossed. Their advocacy was not abstract. It was physical, embodied, and often dangerous. Bessie Coleman was a pioneering aviator, the first African-American woman and first Native American to earn a pilot's license. Barred from U.S. flight schools, she learned French and trained in France, becoming the first known Black person to earn an international pilot's license. Her life reminds us that barriers don't disappear on their own, they're flown over. Edith Kanaka-Ole was a Native Hawaiian composer, kumu hula, and cultural guardian, the first Native Hawaiian on U.S. currency. Through chant, dance, and storytelling, she preserved traditions threatened by cultural erasure. Her advocacy reminds us that protecting language, land, and memory is itself a form of resistance. Native New Yorker Eleanor Roosevelt redefined the role of First Lady and expanded it into a lifelong commitment to human rights. After Franklin Roosevelt's death, she became a key architect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the United Nations. Her quarter reminds us that advocacy does not require authority, but it does require courage and persistence. Eleanor maintained a profoundly intimate, decades-long relationship with journalist Lorena Hickok. Also commemorated in 2023 were Jovita Idar, journalist, educator, and civil rights activist who fought for Mexican-American rights, and Maria Tallchief, Osage ballerina, America's first prima ballerina. If 2023 is about claiming space, then 2024 is about changing systems. These women didn't just push against injustice. They rewrote the rules that sustained it. Law, policy, medicine, music, and identity itself become tools for transformation. The women of 2024 challenge a narrow definition of leadership. Their lives remind us that advocacy can be intellectual, spiritual, creative, and deeply personal, and that some of the most transformative thinkers lived at the margins of respectability in their own time. The Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray was a civil rights activist, legal scholar, poet, and Episcopal priest whose work reshaped American constitutional law. Her theory of Jane Crow influenced both the civil rights movement and feminist legal strategy, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg's arguments before the Supreme Court. Reverend Dr. Murray's life reminds us that justice often advances through those who live beyond society's categories. She had at least 2 significant romantic relationships with women and wondered if she was, quote, one of nature's experiments, a girl who should have been a boy. Dr. Mary Edwards Walker was a Civil War surgeon, abolitionist, suffragist, and the only woman to receive the Medal of Honor to this day. She also defied gender norms unapologetically, wearing pants because they were practical, hygienic, and allowed her to do her job. Her advocacy reminds us that sometimes progress looks like refusing to dress for someone else's comfort. Look how dapper she is in her practical, comfortable pants. Dr. Walker challenged gender norms and lived with presidential candidate Belva Lockwood for several years in Washington, D.C. Celia Cruz was the queen of salsa and the first Afro-Latina on U.S. currency. Her music carried joy, resistance, and cultural memory across borders and generations. With her unmistakable voice and her signature cry, "Azúcar!" she showed that celebration itself can be a form of survival. Also commemorated in 2024 was Patsy Takemoto Mink, the first woman of color and first Asian American woman elected to Congress, notable for her work on Title IX, prohibiting sex-based discrimination in education, and writer, composer, educator, and political activist for Native American rights, Zitkala Shah. By 2025, the program reaches outward again, this time toward truth-telling, access, and legacy. The women confronted violence, exclusion, invisibility, and silence head-on. Their advocacy insists that justice is not complete until it includes everyone. The final year of the American Women's Quarters Program asks us to sit with an uncomfortable truth. Many of the women we honor last are the ones whose stories were hardest to accept and hardest to erase. Their presence on coins isn't closure, it's a challenge. Ida B. Wells was an investigative journalist and civil rights leader who exposed the brutal truth about lynching in America. Through data, reporting, and fearless advocacy, she revealed lynching as a tool of racial terror and power, not justice. Her presence on a coin affirms that truth-telling is one of the most dangerous and necessary forms of advocacy. Dr. Vera Rubin, an astronomer, is the first Jewish person featured on U.S. currency. Dr. Rubin's work helped prove the existence of dark matter in the cosmos, shifting the way scientists study the universe since the 1970s. She also advocated for women in science, having overcome several obstacles through her career in a male-dominated field. Now, please don't ask me any questions after the presentation about her work. I couldn't even understand her Wikipedia entry. Stacey Park Milburn was a disability justice activist who reshaped how America understands access, care, and interdependence. She argued that justice must center the most marginalized, and that community care is not weakness, but strength. Her presence on a coin expands whose advocacy is seen as national contribution. Stacey championed intersectional rights, identifying as queer, disabled, and a person of color, viewing these identities as inseparable. Also commemorated in 2025 were Juliette Gordon Low, the founder of the Girl Scouts of the United States, and Althea Gibson, the first Black tennis player to win a Grand Slam event. Across 4 years, these quarters trace a quiet revolution, not a single narrative of progress, but a mosaic of struggle, creativity, resistance, and care. About half of these women lived lives that, while they may not have identified themselves as such, through today's lens would be seen as lesbian, gay, gender nonconforming, trans, or otherwise not traditionally heteronormative in their relationships and presentation. They pushed the boundaries of gender and sexuality in addition to their work to expand rights for all of us. And together, they remind us that history does not move forward on its own. It moves because people push. And sometimes, finally, it gets minted. I wish I could say in conclusion and simply leave you with admiration for these extraordinary women. But it's 2026. And we're living in a moment when revanchists are actively working to reverse progress, to reclaim symbols, rewrite narratives, and narrow the definition of who belongs in history. And that makes this work, this remembering, urgent. This year marks the 250th anniversary of the United States of America, our semi-quincentennial, or as the Mint sometimes calls it, the semi-Q. To commemorate this milestone, the United States Mint planned one-year-only changes to familiar circulating coins, including the dime, quarter, and half-dollar. According to Mint Deputy Director Christy McNally, these designs are meant to depict the story of America's journey toward a more perfect union, and to give every American the opportunity to hold our nation's storied 250 years of history in the palms of their hands. That promise matters, because as we know, how a nation chooses to tell its story at moments like this reveals what it values and what it fears. Bear with me briefly while I nerd out on government process, because process is where power often hides. How do we get new circulating coins? How were the subjects and designs for the American Women's Quarters and the states and the national parks and other special collections determined? New circulating U.S. coins are the result of legislation passed in Congress, design work by the U.S. Mint artists, public consultation and review by 2 expert bodies, the Citizens Coinage Advisory Committee, or CCAC, and the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, the CFA. The Secretary of the Treasury makes the final decision, but the law requires consultation, expertise, and public input along the way. The semi-quincentennial coin program was authorized by the very same law creating the American Women's Quarters. The law is explicit. It requires designs that reflect the nation's 250-year journey and specifically mandate that at least one quarter depict women's contributions to the founding of the nation or other monumental events in American history. It also requires that the design choices reflect recommendations from experts and the general public through the CCAC and CFA committees I mentioned earlier. Following that mandate, the advisory committees proposed a coherent, historically grounded set of themes for the quarters: the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, abolition, women's suffrage, and civil rights. Taken together, these designs tell a clear story, one that begins in 1776 and continues through the long, unfinished struggle to expand rights, dignity, and access to power. Here is the recommended Declaration of Independence quarter. Lady Liberty, representing our founding ideals, is seen on both the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution quarters. On the abolition quarter, Frederick Douglass represents the abolitionist movement. On the women's suffrage quarter, a suffragist marches for women's right to vote. And on the civil rights quarter, a young Ruby Bridges represents the civil rights movement. Her presence controversial only because she is still living, yet allowed under existing rules because she is depicted in action and not as a bust. Together, these quarters trace 250 years of our American history, not as myth, but as movement. And then, that story was abandoned. I'm saddened to tell you that these beautiful coins will not be finding their way into your coin jar or seat cushions. To name is to give meaning, and to give meaning is to give power. If you lacked power, your history rarely made it onto money. As I mentioned earlier, coins usually appear decades after movements succeed, after laws change and resistance quiets. They don't mark the moment of change, they mark acceptance of change. And that's why histories involving women, Indigenous peoples, LGBTQ+ communities, labor movements, and racial justice so often arrive late or are rolled back entirely. If a story still feels disruptive, it's likely to be excluded. And that brings us to now. Some histories appear late or not at all on coins because money reflects power, not merit. Coins are issued by governments, not historians. What gets minted depends on who holds authority in a given moment, and which stories feel safe, and which still challenge national myths. On March 27, 2025, President Donald J. Trump signed an executive order entitled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. This order requires American history to be rewritten in government documents and websites to eliminate divisive narratives. We've seen countless stories of placards that explain uncomfortable truths about America being removed from museums and parks. Advocacy for women and people of color removed from government websites. A pride flag removed from the Stonewall National Monument. So we must ask, what does it mean when abolition and civil rights, women's suffrage, LGBTQ rights are deemed as divisive? What does it mean when expansion of democracy is treated as controversy? Despite the recommendations of both the CCAC and the CFA, the Secretary of Treasury selected an entirely different set of designs, different figures, different themes, and a radically shortened timeline. On the Declaration of Independence quarter, Lady Liberty is replaced by Thomas Jefferson. On the Constitution quarters, Lady Liberty is replaced by James Madison. Abolition disappears entirely, replaced by a Gettysburg Address quarter featuring Abraham Lincoln. But symbolizing Gettysburg is not the same as honoring abolition. This ignores the centuries of efforts to eliminate the cruel enslavement of people with African ancestry. The efforts of enslaved people to free themselves should be seen as a major contribution. Abolition wasn't a single speech or battle. It was centuries of resistance, led by enslaved people themselves, by free Black activists, by organizers, writers, and revolutionaries who demanded the end of human bondage long before Congress or the battlefield caught up. Slavery persisted after Gettysburg. Emancipation didn't arrive fully formed with a single address. Erasing abolition from the quarter erases that truth. Women's suffrage and civil rights were also removed, replaced by the Mayflower Compact and Revolutionary War imagery. The legally required female figure remains, but she's recast as an unnamed pilgrim woman, standing beside and slightly behind her husband, looking to him for protection. The result is not just a design change, it's a narrative collapse. The recommended series told a story stretching from 1776 through the Civil Rights Movement, a history of expanding rights and contested progress. The approved series begins in 1620 with the Mayflower and ends in 1863, quietly excluding 163 years of history shaped by women, people of color, and grassroots movements. This is not accidental. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Before you leave today, I want to return to where we began, to the smallest piece of history you've ever held in your hand, a coin. Coins feel ordinary. They disappear into your pockets and purses, and they're passed along without thought. And yet, they are among the most deliberate objects a nation creates. They carry not just value, but choice. Every face placed on a coin represents a decision about who matters, whose labor counts, and which stories are allowed to move freely through the world. And for most of our history, that circulation was narrow. Men appeared and women did not. Power was mistaken for contribution, and silence was mistaken for absence. What we've seen today is that women were never missing from our history. They were missing from recognition. The program honored on U.S. coins, especially through the American Women's Quarters program, did not all change the nation in the same way. Some protested, some taught, some healed, some created beauty. Some told the truth when it was dangerous, and some simply refused to step aside. What unites them is not consensus or comfort, but impact. And that's why this moment matters, because memory is not neutral. It is shaped, it's curated, and it can be narrowed as easily as it can be expanded. We're living at a time when symbols are being reclaimed, stories are being compressed, and the definition of who belongs in history is once again being contested. And that's what makes your attention essential. Dr. Timothy Snyder, in his book On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, lesson number 12 is to make eye contact and small talk. This is not just polite. It's part of being a citizen and a responsible member of society. It's a crucial daily act of resistance against authoritarianism. Small talk breaks down social barriers. Collect the U.S. Women's Quarters. Use the quarters you find as a starting point for conversation. Carry a few in your pocket for when you're standing in line at the grocery store or riding the bus. Chat with the checkout clerk who handed you your change. Speak with service people you encounter. Engage with others about the women on the quarters. And let people know about the stories we won't be celebrating on our semi-Q coins. Let them know it's because the people in power are uncomfortable with narratives around expanded rights and democracy. My wife and I have been doing this since 2022, when the first quarter of Maya Angelou was released. We check our change and we save the women's quarters for what we call quarter conversations. We've had wonderful discussions with people across the country, everyone from children to seniors, across gender, ethnicity, and all kinds of dimensions of diversity. And almost without exception, people are delighted for the interaction and the gift of a quarter. The next time you hold a coin, I invite you to pause. Ask yourself, whose story is being carried here? Whose labor made this nation possible? And whose story are we still being asked to forget? Because remembrance is not passive, it's a practice. And the future of our shared story depends on whether we keep insisting, again and again, that more voices belong in circulation. Thank you.